Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Wednesday, the 13th of October. My name's Maggie Lennon, and before we start the programme proper, I'll just update you with the coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 3,288,538 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,691,339 have been confirmed negative, with 597,199 having tested positive. There are 2,581 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 30 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the infection now stands at 8,849. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 918 were in hospital last night, 51 of whom were in intensive care. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, 4,270,126 people had received their first dose of the COVID vaccination and 3,868,656 had received their second. The latest UK daily figures show 138,080 patients who've tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 136 since the day before. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And as at the 10th of October, 11,262 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus was mentioned on the death certificate, according to statistics published today by the National Records of Scotland. In the week, the 4th to the 10th of October, 126 deaths were registered that mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, which is 17 less than last week. The number of deaths from all causes registered in Scotland in this week was 1,353. That's 315 or 30% more than the 5-year average. I'm joined this evening by Richard Thomson MP for Gordon. On recess at the moment, I believe, Richard, is that correct?
On recess, Maggie, but certainly working hard and taking the chance to get out and about round the constituency.
I'm sure that's true. I wasn't suggesting anything else. We start off with the news that Nicola Sturgeon took part in a very important TED talk today as part of the run-up to COP26. She said that Scotland must be careful not to leave communities behind as it transitions away from oil and gas in the TED talk. She said, "We've got to be careful that we don't leave people and communities behind in that transition. We've got to be careful we don't switch domestic production to imports of oil and gas. That would be counterproductive. So the way in which we make the transition matters, but we can't have business as usual, because if we keep telling ourselves we can rely on fossil fuels forever, then we'll never make that transition, and that's the key point we have to address." The First Minister's TED Talk was on the role of smaller countries in climate action as part of the countdown to COP26 series. She asked the people who were listening to today if size mattered, and she said, no, it didn't. Small countries had as big a role to play as large ones. Do you think that's a fair assessment, Richard?
I think it absolutely is, Maggie, and it's about as Barack Obama and others were often want to say, it's not about the example of your power in the world that's important so much as the power of your example. And that's somewhere that Scotland is extraordinarily well placed to lead on here. Scotland has got, as we've spoken about many times on this programme by myself and others, Scotland has got tremendous potential when it comes to renewable energy. We were one of the first countries in the world to go through an industrial revolution, so we know exactly what transformative economic change of that kind looks like. So we've got a sense, I think, instinctively of the size of the challenge and the nature of the transition that needs to take place. But also as a major producer of oil and gas. We know that we need to make an effective and just transition that doesn't leave communities behind, which continues to make sure that we're taking responsibility for our climate actions. And as the First Minister has said, not simply outsourcing our energy production in that regard to other parts of the world, which might not be so stringent as we ourselves would be on ourselves when it comes to monitoring emissions and environmental standards. So when I think one of the points the First Minister said was that when Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Accords and agreements, it was individual cities and localities that continued the leadership in the challenge against climate change. And I think that, she's absolutely spot on in that analysis. And it's the old thing about thinking global and acting local. This isn't a thing that we can simply just leave to governments to do. We have to set our own individual example. We have to set examples in our communities and our local authorities. But it comes back to that thing. It's not about your size or your scale or the examples of your power. It's about the power of the example and the leadership that you can provide in terms of ensuring a more equitable use of resources around the planet and making sure that we are leaving a planet in a fit state for future generations to survive and thrive on.
Obviously, it's hugely important to your own part of the world because of the importance of oil and gas to the local economy. So, how do people feel in the Northeast about the whole concept of a just transition? Do they believe it's possible? And how are they feeling about COP26? Do they feel that they're kind of the bad guys because, they're involved in oil and gas? Are they as engaged in this whole process as lots of other people in Scotland appear to be?
I think the Northeast is particularly aware of the challenges we face simply because there have been so many people either have worked or know someone who has worked, and so much of the economy has benefited from oil and gas over the last few decades. But I think most people accept that a transition needs to happen. I think a chill goes down people's spines when somebody like Boris Johnson comes up to go out to the Moray offshore wind farm, as he did a few weeks ago, and tried to hail Margaret Thatcher as some kind of pathfinder for the environmental lobby because of the rate at which she shut down the coal mines. That was even by his own standards, that was a particularly crass and insensitive comment by the Prime Minister. But there is that, we do need to put a little bit of meat on the bones about how we get that transition, that it's not a binary switch from one form of energy to another. It's about making sure that we keep the human capital, the financial capital that we have in the Northeast here, making sure that we're transitioning and industrialising and getting the full economic and employment benefits that we can from the position that we're in here, because we are quite lucky in a way that many of the skills that have been used in the oil and gas sector are exactly the sort of skills that are going to be needed to succeed in the renewables economy. We're also well placed with Peterhead and St Fergus for carbon storage and sequestration and capture. So there are so many cutting edge technologies that potentially we're on the cusp of being world leaders of, and it requires that extra support from government. The Scottish Government, in its agreement with the Greens, there's a £500 million package there for Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and Moray to play our part in that energy transition, even though that the Scottish Government doesn't have the constitutional responsibility for the energy sector. It's really about having the UK government step up as well, in the absence of Scotland having these powers for itself. I mean, obviously the best situation would be for us to be independent and in full regulatory and policy control. But until that day, we need to make sure that we're getting a fair crack of the whip in terms of the resources and making sure that the energy transition that we do go through is one that we go through as far as possible on our own terms, protecting, as I say, all that's good about the industries that we've been able to build up here over the last few decades.
So does all of that mean then it doesn't matter that the Scottish Government don't seem to be willing to really come out one way or the other and say whether the Campbell oil field should be developed? They seem to be suggesting that it should go ahead. Is that not?
I think, with respect, I think Campbell's are the. No, I don't think it is. Campbell's I don't think it is a mixed message. And in many ways, Campbell's not the issue here. As part of the sector deal that the UK government's agreed with the oil and gas sector, there is going to be a climate change checkpoint introduced in the process of assessing new oil and gas fields. Now, I think Nicola Sturgeon's quite right. I fully support her in this, that it's only right that Campbell gets assessed on exactly the same yardstick as any new fields, because when we're talking about new fields, it's important to understand that's not talking about increasing production all what you're talking about is reducing the rate of decline. Because the less self-sufficient we are in oil and gas, the more, while that transition goes on to new forms of energy, the more we're going to import. And when we're importing it, we're basically offshoring our emissions that are associated with that and losing the regulatory and environmental controls that are there, and it's harming our energy security. So Cambo should be assessed on exactly the same basis as any other field, but we should be clear that that's as part of our transition, and it's not about ramping up production, it's about simply trying to slow the rate of decline as we go into that transition.
It would appear that the NHS continues to be dogged by technology problems, and England's NHS app that lets people prove their vaccine status is not working for some, apparently. A problem that could cause havoc for those who need it for foreign travel or to gain access to domestic venues and events. An error message when people try to access their COVID pass, which normally features a QR code and details about which jabs they've had, simply displayed the message, "Please try again later." NHS Digital confirmed there was a problem in a statement on its Twitter feed where it said that the latest updates would come from. A post said there are currently issues with accessing the COVID pass on the NHS app and website. We are investigating the issue and will update as soon as we can. An email from NHS Digital's customer service team to one user who reported the problem said it started at around noon today and that officials were currently liaising with the service provider who is responsible for the background operations of the COVID pass. They added that the problem was temporary, but said, "We are unable to provide a resolution at this time." People attending some events and venues in England may also be affected if they're required to use the app to demonstrate their inoculation. Apparently, there were some pretty violent scenes at airports in England today and people not being able to get on their flights. With the outages we had on Facebook and other social media earlier this week, maybe we should just all go back to pen and paper. But joking aside, if these things don't work, and the Scottish Government got criticised because when they introduced their app, it was a few glitches in that. But if these things don't work and people can't rely on them, does it not make people then feel that they're really not worthwhile and it makes them less keen to engage in that whole process? The technology needs to work if people are going to believe in it, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, and I think it's unfortunate that these things happen. And I can, obviously, as you said, Maggie, that the Scottish Government Act app that was rolled out wasn't without its own problems, albeit most of them seem to be resolved after a day or so after the initial flood of people trying to not so much download the app as get the information that was held on their vaccines pulled through from existing NHS databases sitting at the back of that. But I just hope that all the politicians who were so keen to jump on top of that as a sign of apparent incompetence are just as quick to jump on this one, particularly those of a conservative bent. But you're absolutely right. It's unfortunate when technology is rolled out. I can understand the desire to get information, to get the technology out there to make things as convenient for people as it ever possibly can be. But it does dent people's faith a little bit. But I think at the same time, I don't know quite what the situation is in England, but in Scotland, even without the app, there was always the ability to go on to your PC or your iPad or whatever and download a digital copy as a PDF, or as you say, to print it out, and there it is, and if not quite pen and paper, then certainly inkjet and paper.
Yeah, I think the problems were arising with people who were standing in their check-in queues trying to get the information, and maybe planning is needed. I was in London at the weekend and was needed my pass to get into a theatre. My pass looked a bit different from everyone else's pass around about me because I had the Scottish pass. I pointed this out to the guy in the door who hardly looked at it, and quite frankly, I could have shown him the QR code for the restaurant in which I'd just had dinner, and I don't think he'd have been any of the wiser. But I got into the plane, it was jolly good, so that's the main thing. Border Force staff who enact Priti Patel's plans to push back migrant boats in the Channel could be given immunity from conviction if a refugee dies, officials have confirmed. The Home Secretary is seeking to introduce a provision in the Nationality and Borders Bill that could give officials legal protection in the event that someone drowns. Whether the provision, which is tucked away in an obscure corner of the bill, would actually protect officers from conviction under international maritime law could be tested in the courts. If it comes into force, The provisions of the bill means that anyone arriving in the UK via an illegal route, such as by a small boat across the Channel, could have their claim ruled as inadmissible, receiving a jail sentence of up to 4 years, have no recourse to public funds, and could have their family members barred from joining them. The Home Office said last month that it was training Border Force guards to push back small boats. Under international maritime law, to which the UK is a signatory, officers would be liable to prosecution if their actions cause a migrant to be in danger of drowning. Now, we know that this nationality and immigration bill is absolutely dreadful. This is the latest piece of information to come out, which is sending shockwaves around immigration lawyers. But a recent report by a group of immigration lawyers claimed that there were at least 10 breaches of international law and domestic law in the bill, including 2 breaches of 2 articles in the UN Convention of Refugees and 2 articles in the European Convention on Human Rights. I just wonder, what's the atmosphere in Westminster around this? Is there much opposition from the opposition parties? And is there any hope that some of this may be challenged in the House of Lords? Or do you think, Richard, this is a done deal and this bill is going to go through as written?
I think there's always a danger that anything this UK Tory government puts forward is going to be a done deal simply because of the majority. But I would expect that certainly, but from the SNP members, there will be very, very strong opposition to this because, as we said at the top of the show, it's about the power of your example, and the UK government seems to be determined to shred any remaining moral authority it might actually have in the world with this kind of proposal. So I would hope that it will certainly be encountering stiff opposition in the Commons. Funnily enough, it's a strange state of affairs that we're in. These maybe a testament to these strange times that often a voice of moderation and reason is to be found in the House of Lords more than it is on the Conservative side of the House of Commons. And as a Democrat, that does not fill me with a huge amount of confidence that you have to sometimes look to the House of Lords for that kind of reason and balance and touchstone of sanity that is completely absent from the government and its backbench loyal supporters. But I think the other danger for the government in this is, which then becomes a danger for all of us, is that it gets challenged in the court under our international obligations, and then you get locked into another cycle of debate about who elected the judges, completely riding roughshod over the role that an independent judiciary is supposed to play in terms of having a supervisory role and in terms of interpreting the law that politicians pass and making sure it's compliant with our obligations that we've signed up to. So I just Priti Patel is somebody who's clearly significantly out of her depth in the role that she's in, and is more interested in the next day's headlines and the red tops than she is in running her department effectively. There's so much of all that she does and says is simply virtue signalling. But I would hope that certainly this will come under stiff opposition in the Commons from the SNP, certainly, and I would hope others. And I would expect that there will be plenty of voices in the House of Lords speak out against this as well. I just hope that the government does take heed, but I have to say that I am not overly confident in that.
What stage is the bill at the moment?
I couldn't honestly tell you without going on the Parliament website because it's not my area of responsibility. Okay. I'm front bench with responsibility in Wales and Northern Ireland, but it still has to pass through significant legislative hurdles.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the first time that the UK government have sought to help their kind of chums avoid prosecution. They've already brought in legislation, which means that people, I think they have brought it in, I may be wrong, maybe it's still to be brought in, but it was about giving exemption and immunity to people in the armed forces if people die as a result of being in their custody, either through torture or whatever. So it seems this idea that you can make people who support the government's agenda immune to prosecution is something that the British government are quite keen to pursue. And my take on all of this is that she's not bothered by the fact that she's breaching 2 articles in the UN Convention on Refugees or 2 articles in the European Convention on Human Rights, because we know that, if possible, the British government want to become unsign those. They no longer want to be signatories of either of these documents. And the new two-tier asylum system that she's bringing in, which says it's okay for the British government to accept refugees from camps that they've pre-selected and pre-vetted, I suppose, but it won't be all right to accept refugees who come through, and we shouldn't say illegal routes because there is nothing illegal about claiming asylum, but irregular routes, which is people who are arriving under their own steam, whether it's on a small boat, in the back of a lorry, or I suspect even off the back of an aeroplane. So that's my real concern, is that it's not going to bother the UK government if international law or they're challenged by international. They'll just choose to not incorporate any of those parts of the international law into their own legislative programme. We've seen what they've already done about the Scottish Government's attempts to enshrine the rights of the child into Scottish legislation, something that everybody in the Scottish Parliament voted for. The UK Government have said you don't have the competency to do that. And nobody said to them, why wouldn't you want to enshrine the rights of the child in your own legislation? So I think we're just seeing the start of a much bigger attack on things that have really underpinned Britain's role on the world stage. And that's really terrifying.
Yeah, I've just had a quick look, and the Nationality and Borders Bill is at the committee stage. So that's the chance where you get into you stop talking about the general principles and you get into the nitty gritty. So that's a stage where amendments can get tabled, and I'm certain they will be. But I think there's a lot in what you say there, Maggie, that we have a government that is at the UK level that is emboldened, that is riding at the head of the mob here in terms of trying to rile people up about foreign courts or lawyers who are not accountable to anyone. Fancy, basically bringing the legal system and many of the pillars of an open democratic society and putting them under great pressure simply because they think that way lies the route to popularity. We see that in some of the language that they use round about their culture war that some of them want to fight. And I think you're right. There are many of them who give a very good impression of not seeming to care about the damage it does either in the moment or the damage it does to the body politic long term. But ultimately, if the UK government continues down this route, it will simply put itself out, and we see it in the way it's negotiated over Brexit. It eventually puts itself in with pariahs or states that are in danger in Europe becoming pariahs under their current leadership, like Hungary under Orban. Basically, that's the level that the UK government is in danger of relegating itself to. And as a government that never misses an opportunity to beat its chest about how Britain punches above its weight in the world and the strength of its example and its global Britain and all the rest of it, there's no surer way to diminish any reality that there is in that standing than by carrying on behaving in a way which shows no heed to fundamental global human rights or our international obligations.
It's less a position of Britain rules the waves as Britain waves the rules, and they're doing that in the north of Ireland as well. So the EU has offered to abandon 80% of checks on supermarket goods that enter Northern Ireland from Britain. But officials in Brussels have conceded that they were preparing for the worst, amid signs that Boris Johnson is unlikely to accept the deal. Maroš Šefčovič, the EU's Brexit commissioner, presented 4 papers at a press conference on Wednesday evening as he sought to bring an end to the destabilising tussle between the UK and Brussels, saying they were not being presented as a take-it-or-leave-it basis. An appeal was made for pragmatism from Johnson, but the chances of a compromise appeared low. David Frost, the UK's Brexit minister, remains insistent that an entirely new protocol should be negotiated that does not have a role for the European Court of Justice as an arbiter of EU law in Northern Ireland. A 3-week negotiating period is expected for talks over the EU's new proposals, but Brussels is equally determined that it will not renegotiate the fundamentals of the tortuously negotiated protocol which keeps Northern Ireland within the single market, policed by the ECJ, and draws a customs border down the Irish Sea. The EU proposal, described as a new model on food and medicines, is a significant concession from Brussels, which was previously called for the UK to align with the bloc's food and plant health rules to avoid checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. While the EU continues to say checks and controls in the Irish sea border are necessary to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland and represent the Brexit choices made by the British government, officials admitted more clearly than ever before that its implementation has created unintended consequences for businesses and consumers. In a further concession, trucks carrying mixed loads, for example, a lorry bound for a Northern Irish supermarket laden with meat, dairy, and confectionery, would only have to provide one health certificate per journey rather than one for each product line. Customs paperwork will also be halved by more generously defining what goods are deemed not at risk of entering the EU single market via the Irish border. In exchange for these looser controls, the UK will have to ensure border inspection posts are up and running, and the EU officials have access to real-time data on checks. These are existing requirements of the protocol, and EU officials say they have seen progress on access to databases, having previously accused the UK of foot dragging. This story has kind of caught fire, particularly with Dominic Cummings' announcements that, in his opinion, the UK were always going to rip up the protocol, and yes, of course, they lied about it, which has then made that the former Taoiseach, who was responsible for negotiating the protocol, has gone very public today and said to the rest of the world, it's simple, you can't trust Britain. If you're about to do a trade deal with Britain, they lie, and they're going to lie with you. So we've just been talking about the sort of moral ineptitude of the British government under the issues with migrants. Now it appears that they're quite willing to flaunt their reputation in terms of international trade. Is that what they seriously meant by making Britain great again? I mean, this just seems... Brussels appears to have bent over backwards and sideways to help. And yet Boris is determined to just say, we're not interested. What do you think that means for a hard border on the Isle of Ireland and the border down the Irish Sea?
But don't you know, they need us more than we need them. They need us to buy their BMWs and their Prosecco, and we hold all the cards. And well, we're certainly seeing all of that crumble. And exactly as you say, Maggie, it's that loss of standing. I mean, one of the many reasons I want Scottish independence is so that we can take our place once again in the world and be part of that rules-based international order where you say what you mean what you say, and you stick by your obligations, and you uphold democracy and free and fundamental human rights in that manner. And the UK government is basically trashing what little of its reputation it has with this. Now, as the SNP's Westminster spokesperson in Northern Ireland, I've had a lot of discussions with politicians on all sides of the debate in Northern Ireland and in communities when I was over there in Belfast and a few other places a few weeks ago when I went over for a week to see what it was like for myself. And I don't doubt the sincerity of those who are opposed to the protocol, because it is causing some difficulties for some businesses. And also, particularly for those from a unionist background, it's creating the symbolism of a border that they were always told wasn't going to be there, and they've been utterly betrayed in many respects by the stance that the UK government has taken. But the UK government seems to be banking on the EU not enforcing checks on the island of Ireland to try and play the game that it's playing. And I think that the tragedy that we are in danger of experiencing here is that the European Union has been extremely pragmatic in the set of proposals that it has brought forward in terms of how checks could be reduced. And I'm between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and I'm beginning to wonder if the reason that it's encountering such opposition is whether it's nothing to do with Northern Ireland at all, whether or not the Conservatives think this is just playing well with their base back in England and other parts of the UK. And there's also another aspect to this which isn't often remarked upon. It's that the border in trade terms between Northern Ireland and Great Britain is pretty much the sort of trade border we could expect between an independent Scotland and the EU and the remainder of the UK if it was still outside the European Union. And I set off a bit of a firecracker in the House of Commons a few weeks ago when I made the point that if Scotland was independent, that we would have free trade once again with unimpeded trade once again with Northern Ireland in a way that we don't as part of the UK. And that kind of really enraged the Tory Brexiteers and a few of the folk from the Northern Ireland Unionist parties, but it remains a fact. So I hope that I've called for the UK government to go into these talks in good faith, to negotiate in good faith, because quite clearly there's an economic reorientation happening in Northern Ireland. I think that we're seeing some of the read across to that in terms of politics. That's put the fright, and that's panicked a lot of unionists in Northern Ireland. We're seeing threats to bring down the Assembly later on this month if there is not a suitable deal renegotiated. But from what I've read of the EU proposals, it is bringing pretty much everything that every pragmatic player in this debate has called for in terms of reducing the checks that have been made necessary by the protocol, which, let's not forget, was negotiated by Lord David Frost himself, Lord Frost.
Indeed.
So he's basically kicking off against the deal that he himself on Christmas Eve last was hailing as a triumph and one of the biggest deals to ever be negotiated in that sort of timescale. So, quite frankly, it's an absolute bin fire, the UK position. And, I really don't understand why we're persisting with a low flyer like Frost, other than in that position, other than the fact it seems to be playing to the Tory base. And Boris Johnson seems to think that that's a useful place for him to be in politically at the moment. But it's certainly not a good place for the people of Northern Ireland or for anyone who cares about how the UK is seen in the world, or indeed for trying to map out the relationship that a future independent Scotland would have with the rest of Great Britain.
I think your take on it is pretty on the button. I think you're right. I think this is just absolutely macho posturing on behalf of the Conservative government and flexing muscles that they actually don't have. It's really quite frightening. There doesn't seem to be anything that Boris Johnson won't do just to cause trouble, irrespective of the mayhem that it's causing back at home. Part of that mayhem, of course, has been the shortage of HGV drivers. But a government minister has admitted today that the UK government has approved just 20, that's 20, temporary visas to meet the UK shortage from the 100,000 visas that they were going to make available. Responding to the staggering omission from Oliver Dowden on LBC, Gavin Newlands MP said the cost of Brexit is soaring and the UK government is failing to tackle the severe staffing shortages across the economy and public services caused by Boris Johnson's disastrous hard Brexit deal. The SNP transport spokesman said people in Scotland are being forced to pay an increasingly high price for Brexit despite voting to remain in the EU, and the only way to protect Scotland's economic interests and place in Europe is to become an independent country. Commenting, SNP transport spokesman Gavin Newlands MP said, "This is a staggering admission of failure by the Tory government. Instead of making excuses, Tory ministers must urgently get a grip on the severe staffing shortages and soaring costs caused by Boris Johnson's disastrous hard Brexit." I mean, 20 out of 100,000 by any standard is a complete and utter failure. When I first glimpsed at the headline, I thought it said 20,000. And I thought, oh, well, 1 out of 5 is not bad. And then when I reread it and saw it was only 20, I nearly fell off my chair. Nobody could have thought, nobody thought we'd get 100,000 HGV drivers. Nobody could have thought surely it would be as low as 20.
Well, if it is as low as 20, they're going to have to be taking a leaf out of the logistical playbook of Santa and his elves, because they'll be working nearly as hard in the run up to Christmas, I think. No, I mean, it's quite ridiculous. And again, it's completely self-inflicted. There is a shortage of lorry drivers across Europe. That's not in dispute. COVID hasn't helped. That's not in dispute. But the fact is that other countries aren't experiencing the same degree of shortage, and it's not going to have the same impact on their supply chains as it's having here. And we've really shot ourselves in the foot with Brexit, because it's created an environment where many citizens of the EU no longer feel as welcome as they did. That was, people. The UK government was warned about that repeatedly, but it paid absolutely no heed. And the big problem is, when you're not getting lorries taking, it's not just the goods that don't come over from the European Union now, which are contributing to shortages and inflation and all the rest of it. It's the bit called cabotage. where these EU truckers would pick up loads within the UK and transport them to somewhere else. And that capacity is now out of the system. And simply giving lorry drivers a 3-month visa to come over is not going to cut the mustard whatsoever, because why would you uproot yourself to go and work in the UK where you don't feel you're particularly welcome, where where the working conditions, as has come to the fore recently for lorry drivers, is not particularly good. You're going to want a longer run at it than that, and you're also going to the UK will need to give them a longer run at it as well, because the problems are not going to disappear after Christmas when people kind of turn off the spending taps a bit in January and February, as we all traditionally do. I met a haulage company in my constituency not so long ago, and they made a very salient point to me that, look, you could train an HGV driver, you can get them through their HGV test, but that doesn't make them a competent HGV driver. It takes a long time, months of experience before they're really competent to go out on road driving, as it was described to me, what is effectively a missile down the motorway. So, this is going to stretch already strained supply chains to breaking point, and a 3-month visa just isn't going to cut it. And the UK government needs to put lorry drivers on the shortage list and stop confusing the fact that just because lorry driver wages are going up, that's not happening because of increased efficiency or increased productivity. It's simply allowing the companies that are cash rich to cannibalize, or with a decent enough cash flow, to cannibalise the industry and take away drivers from other important parts of the economy that need them, that aren't in the position to pay those same high wages. Paying higher wages out of improved productivity is great, but paying it because there's a shortage of labour isn't. And we don't just wave a magic wand and say abracadabra and create all the lorry drivers that we need overnight, any more than we create the butchers that we need overnight to avoid the looming crisis in the pig and pork industry.
Indeed. I mean, all this narrative that it's about creating highly skilled British workers. Yeah, well, it takes a while. People have got to go through the training. My favourite meme about the whole issue around HGV is the one where you see Her Majesty on the phone to someone saying, "Yes, I did drive a truck in the Second World War. Why do you ask?" Carrying on the sort of disastrous issue of logistics, however, it's not just about HGV, not being enough HGV drivers. Almost £1.5 billion worth of goods being imported into the UK will be hit by shipping delays in the run up to Christmas if the backlog at Felixstowe continues until the festive season, research has suggested. Clothing imports would be most affected by congestion at the ports, the analysis by the risk modelling company the Russell Group have found, including products shipped to the UK from Asia by some of the high street's best known brands. Retailers including Asda, Tesco, John Lewis and Marks and Spencer's are estimated to be among the most exposed to the port disruption as they import large amounts of clothing. There are delays for large ships docking at Felixstowe, which handles about 40% of containers coming in and out of the UK, while goods are taking longer to leave the port to continue their journey to customers owing to the backlog of containers caused by the shortage of HGV drivers. The world's largest container shipping company, the Danish firm AP Møller Maersk, called Felixstowe one of its biggest global challenges on account of the congestion. Maersk said congestion at Felixstowe had been building for the past 2 weeks, meaning the company had to dock as many as 1 in 3 of its large vessels at continental ports instead, including Rotterdam. So one assumes then, Richard, that's also having a knock-on effect to other global ports. It's almost like bed blocking, it's container blocking. So the whole sort of European logistics is being snarled up. I can't remember the name of the UK minister back in the heady days of Brexit negotiation, who seemed to suddenly realise rather late in the day that Britain was an island and that ports were tremendously important for the importation of goods. Like, can you remember who came out and said that? I mean, it
was Dominic Raab, who's
Oh,
now our
was it
Deputy
Dominic
Prime
Raab?
Minister.
Right. Okay. So again, we are an island, and therefore getting goods to us, we've got limited opportunities. Have the government made any comment about this backlog? Have they said anything? Do they have a plan to try and fix this, or is this just we're just going to have to live with it? Again, we were warned about these sorts of delays.
Well, yeah, it was Dominic Raab who said he hadn't fully appreciated the significance of the Dover-Calais crossing. I suppose that's one up from, I can't remember who the minister was who signed a contract with a ferry company that didn't actually have any ferries and was planning to sail them out of a port in Belgium that wouldn't be able to handle them even if they did exist. So it's just symptom of the poor planning. But, we have obviously COVID, we have all sorts of labour shortages, and Brexit is just a self-inflicted sore on top of that. But no, in short, the UK government doesn't have a plan. It can't move the containers out of there on the lorries for the reasons we've just been talking about. And it's just that if there is a backlog in the port, then it stands to reason that new consignments can't come in. I mean, I've always meant to read this book, but I've never ever got round to it. But I remember an economics lecturer of mine when I was doing a postgrad a few years ago. It was reading a book about how a box changed the world, and what he was talking about was the shipping containers and how that completely standardised and revolutionised world trade. And so much of our trade now in our business and world of business and commerce is dominated by very, very tight supply chains domestically with just-in-time management, very little in the way of inventories, but also very, very long lead-in times as these goods are shipped from one side of the world to the other on these massive cargo ships. And if one of the most fundamental points in that is in terms of getting the goods into the country and onto the backs of lorries so they can get distributed out to the distribution hubs and from then onto the individual stores and warehouses. If that breaks, then everything else breaks. You might find out that we don't have such a shortage of lorry drivers after all, because the goods simply won't be coming in at a rate that is challenging them quite so much. So it's just another part of the crisis that's slowly beginning to engulf this UK government. Some of it is self-inflicted. Some of it will be caused by poor reactions to it, but an awful lot of it will also come as simply new external challenges as well that they no longer have the capacity to deal with. And as we're in the lead up to things like COP26, and we're trying to reset our relationships with Europe. Right now, the government seems to be involved in a great deal more firefighting than it should be if it wants to be looking ahead. It's almost a bit like a driver who's obsessed with the squashed fly in the windscreen rather than looking half a mile ahead for dangers that might be coming. And it's just going to spiral into this conservative winter of discontent and beyond, simply because we have a government that has a cabinet full of people who are there based on loyalty to the Prime Minister rather than any talent. And we've got a Prime Minister who is there on his ability to distract and entertain rather than to get to grips with detail and set any kind of meaningful direction.
I suppose one thing it has shown up is just the amount of goods that we bring into Britain that are not raw materials. And I was thinking way back to when I was in primary school when I first learned about imports and exports. And I think if we looked at what the import and export back in the 60s was, it would be an awful lot more raw materials. And the fact that one of the things that's going to be affected is the importation of clothes made overseas. These are clothes made cheaply overseas because wages are low in Asia. I suppose if we're looking at it from a kind of green perspective, you might say, well, if this actually stops that particular trade and stops the importation of cheap clothing in preference for something that's made at home, long term down the line, that would be a good green answer. But again, I suspect, while that might be good for the planet, it's not really good for household budgets. And we've become so used, especially in Western Europe, to this throwaway culture. You wear something for a season and then it goes in the bin, or it may get recycled to a charity shop, but it's likely to be discarded. So it would take a long time, I think, to change that whole approach to how we consume products. But if I was being a Pollyanna type green person, maybe I'd try and make that case, but I suspect that would fall on deaf ears. Sticking to a story at home, a new group will be set up to make sure that everyone at risk of suicide can access the right support when they need it, following recommendations made by the National Suicide Prevention Leadership Group. The Suicidal Crisis Support Action Group will drive the implementation of the time, space and compassion approach which is a new way to improve help for people who are suicidal. Nigel Henderson, former chief executive at Penumbra, has been appointed as national lead for the suicidal crisis support to lead this work. And the Scottish Government say they welcome the report from the NSPLG and the recommendation it makes on improving responses to people in suicidal crisis, and they will consider the recommendations in full. Richard, we know that the cases of suicide are increasing, especially in young men. That's been a factor for quite some time. The story that's come out with this press release today doesn't give us any information about funding or how this new approach will be delivered. I mean, quite a lot of early suicide prevention at the moment is delivered through a whole vast array of actors, a lot are in the third sector. And I'm just wondering, in your part of the country, is there a growing concern about the number of potential suicides, especially with all the mental health issues that are going to come about as a result of COVID? And do you welcome this approach?
Well, yes, I do welcome it, and I think there's as much concern in the northeast of Scotland as there is anywhere else. Of course, we have the added difficulty here of we're several years into a downturn in the oil and gas industry, which, allied to the austerity that everyone else has experienced as well, has taken its toll on people, and particularly where you've had you have people who've lost their job, and with it a great deal of self-esteem that has come with it. And I think there's a particular problem there, as we said, about men, but particularly where there has been that culture of the men being the main breadwinner, and then suddenly finding themselves not being in that position and not being able to, provide for for the family unit as they had in the past. I think that has played a particular role in mental health in this area. We've also got the added factor of rurality and the loneliness that can sometimes bring, in terms of people being more isolated socially by distance and by lack of transport opportunities as well. So there are some particular cultural and economic factors that also contribute to the pressures that can be on people's mental health in parts of the northeast at the moment, whether that's in urban parts of the northeast or, as I say, in some of the rural parts. But I think anything that looks at this time, compassion, space approach has to be a good thing, because however much we're doing to support people, there will always be people who aren't aware of the support that is there, that therefore need to be signposted to it if it's possible. But it's also about, I think, helping others to recognise some of the signs and to help reach out to people, that it's okay not to be okay sometimes, and just to understand that, mental health isn't an equilibrium that you achieve, that everybody's state of mind and mental health, we all have good days, we all have days that aren't quite so good, and that there are people who need help to manage some of the things that are happening in their life, and to help to try and establish a better balance, accepting that it's never ever a smooth path. So I think that time, space, compassion approach is the right one, and let's just see the further detail that emerges. But certainly, we're never doing enough to help people with mental health, and we particularly need to be helping and making it as accessible as possible for people to access help who have traditionally would maybe have been quite resistant to the idea that they need help. And it's all about changing the culture and the language and the dialogue, I think.
And that is often men, just because men are
Yeah.
not often as good at sharing their feelings. There have been some quite interesting and really successful initiatives, though, to help men who are suffering from mental health issues. The Men Sheds initiative,
Yeah.
which you've seen pop up all over the country, seem to be really working and doing well. And I think it's right. I mean, I don't think anyone's going to take any issue with this initiative, but the devil, like everything, will be in the detail, and really how much money is going to be behind this initiative and what the timescales are. And if it is about expanding this time, space, compassion approach and allowing lots of actors to be involved in delivering that, and however they interact with people who are at risk, then that would be positive. But again, like we said
Absolutely,
with
and I
other
think it
things,
has to be about. It has to be about more than thinking that a mental health intervention is about pulling back somebody who finds himself at the brink of crisis. It's about maintaining that well-being, and that's where I think men's sheds have been particularly good in giving men of a certain age an outlet and a sense of worth and value, because there are many things that can contribute to our self-esteem, and if for whatever reason you find yourself deprived of that, one or more of those for any reasons, that can be what sets somebody who was otherwise on an even keel. It can set them on that path. So it's about a whole range of things, and it's not always about dealing with the immediate crisis.
And I think you're right, reaching it, embedding that in the community will be increasingly important, especially in rural communities, where a lot of people who don't live in the country, I think, have this idea that rural life is completely idyllic all of the time. And you couldn't possibly have any issues if you live in a nice part of the country. But actually, as you say, the very isolation of rural living can actually be part of the problem. Sticking then with the idea and the importance of communities, pubs, restaurants, woodlands, and a church are to be brought into community ownership and use through new funding. More than £1 million of the Scottish Land Fund is being awarded to 8 local community groups to help them take ownership of the land and buildings that matter to them. The funding was announced by Land Reform Minister Mary McCallan on a visit to Newcastleton and District Community Trust, which purchased part of the Tarras Water and Home Hill estate with a grant of $850,000 from the Scottish Land Fund last year. This is Community Land Week, which is profiling organisations that have taken ownership of land and buildings during the pandemic. Minister for Environment and Land Reform, Mary McCallan, said, all across Scotland, communities are taking ownership of the land and buildings that matter to them, with the support of the Scottish Land Fund. I know how hard people will have worked to develop their projects and to achieve this success, and I look forward to seeing the benefits for their communities. Richard, how much community ownership is there in your neck of the woods, and are there any particular success stories that you would want to share?
Yeah, in terms of community ownership, when I was the co-leader of Aberdeenshire Council, we revamped our community asset transfer policy, because community groups have got different levels of enthusiasm and capacity sometimes, and some are well equipped to take on the ownership of a piece of land or a building and really drive forward with bringing that into positive use for the communities, whereas others maybe they don't want the responsibility of being in charge of the fabric of a building and maintaining it. And so we recognised that there was a spectrum there of ambitions and willingness to take on that sort of, an appetite to take on that sort of risk. But there's a couple of initiatives particularly that I would take in the ward that I used to represent in Ellenland District in Aberdeenshire Council. One of them is in Colliston, where the community, after securing lots of funding to renovate the community hall, they took on a piece of land at the back of there and have turned it into turning it into a community space for the area. The other one, and this is a real success story, is the Victoria Hall in Ellen. Now, previously it was a kind of slightly, it was a much loved but underused asset that the council wasn't really running to its full effect. And there's a couple who went in there at the head of the management committee to take it, who took it on. And now they're fully booked out. They're investing in the fabric of the building, the monies that they're able to take from the various groups that are coming in. They're able to offer lets to the community to come in, whether it's ballroom or anything else that you can think of in that space. And the real success pre-pandemic was they actually managed to secure tens of thousands of pounds to put in a digital projector and a really, really good sound system, turned it into a cinema. And they would have a children's film and a more adult-orientated film, as well as being able to show some major sporting and other cultural events. And that was something that in a hall that would otherwise have been locked up with a draft blowing through it and the dust gathering in the corners, and they've really brought it to light and opened it up to the community, and it's really captured people's imagination. So, Ellen hasn't. I'm not sure if Ellen ever did have a cinema before, but it's absolutely fantastic to see that, and people now go along, whether they're care much for the film or not. It's a community event when that happened, and I hope that we're able to get back on track with that. But I think giving people the opportunity to take ownership of land or take on the stewardship or the custodianship of land or an asset and to put it to a more positive community use, particularly where it's going underused, I think is fantastic. And £1 million is not a lot of money in the grand scheme of things, but it will make a really, really big difference, I'm sure, for all the groups that have benefited from that.
You've raised two good points there. The one is capacity, and I agree. I mean, it worries me sometimes that you can get a lot of very enthusiastic amateurs, and sometimes there are people who are not really equipped to take on the financial management of an asset, and therefore it can cause more damage than it can cause good. But the example you've given in Ellen sounds fantastic, but if I was a cynic, I'd be tempted to say, well, why didn't it have such a vibrant outlook when the local authority ran it? If it was just about local people coming up with ideas. And when community transfer became such an important element of the Scottish Government's policy, I was a bit concerned. And I think if we dug deep enough, we would find examples of this in Scotland. I was a bit concerned that it might be a way for local authorities to just offload assets that they just got tired of running. And it was a way of just getting rid of them, which wouldn't necessarily be picked up by the community and run. So actually, there might be a lot more assets have been lost than have been picked up by the community. So is that a fair criticism, or am I just being an old cynic?
No, I mean, I think there's nothing in principle that says a council couldn't run assets like that in the same way. But I think it comes down again to sometimes to the capacity and the level of empowerment that there is in council staff. And often it's not, it's not for every situation, but sometimes where you do get a very, very enthusiastic group of local people who do have that capacity or who can be supported in terms of their legal obligations that then come with taking that on, it can in many ways be a better route. But I don't think there's a local authority in the country that probably doesn't have assets that are property assets that are surplus to the requirements in terms of providing their core services. We know the financial pressures that all parts of the public sector, but particularly local government, are under. So I think that sometimes it's, I can understand the if something is in the public realm, there's a desire that it should stay there. This is a way of keeping it in the public realm. It's not necessarily about selling off assets, although that sometimes has its place as well if something is no longer required and doesn't have a front-facing public purpose. But where you do have that strong community interest and a viable proposal for it, then I think the local authorities are well placed to support that. And as I say, the outcomes can often be better than just keeping it in the traditional model there. And of course, it still belongs to the public. There's usually in the constitutions it's put in that these assets, in the event of the group being wound up, they do return to the local authority or the public realm, or it has to go to another group which would carry out the same purpose. So it's not about losing them to the public realm. Ultimately, that's still there at the back of it.
Okay, well, best wishes to the 8 who've been lucky enough to get their hands on some cash. And finally, Star Trek actor William Shatner has become the oldest human in space at the age of 90 during a brief but successful second crewed flight on Wednesday of Blue Origin's New Shepard rocket ship from the West Texas desert. The Canadian, who for 4 decades played Captain James Kirk, the fearless commander of the USS Enterprise, was invited by the private space company's founder and Amazon tycoon Jeff Bezos to join 3 civilian crewmates for the almost 11-minute leap to the stars. I guess that's it, huh? Shatner said as he was about to experience real-life space travel after decades of fictional intergalactic voyaging. Shatner captured the mantle of the oldest space traveller from Wally Funk, an 82-year-old former test pilot who flew with Bezos. The US space agency NASA also tweeted a good luck message to Shatner. "We wish you all the best on your flight to space. You are and always shall be our friend," it said. After separation from its booster rocket, the New Shepard capsule reached a maximum altitude of 66.5 miles, beyond the 100-kilometre or 62-mile Kármán line, which is recognised internationally as the boundary of space, giving the crew 3 to 4 minutes of weightlessness. After re-entering the atmosphere, the capsule fell back to Earth and made a gentle touchdown guided by 3 parachutes, almost 10 minutes and 30 seconds after liftoff. New Shepard's reusable booster landed again safely after almost 8 minutes in flight. William Shatner described his trip to the final frontier of space as the most profound experience. Well, while I'm sure it's been very nice for Willie to go up in space, and at 90-year-old, he must have a fairly strong heart. I'd have thought that might have been a strain for anybody. These private rockets, they're just toys for boys, aren't they? Toys for very rich boys.
And very rich girls as well, no doubt. There's this. It chafes with me that, I mean, no harm to William Shatner, and I hope that he enjoyed boldly going, and I hope that at 90 I have a fraction of his spirits. But I suspect the extent of my ambitions, if I reach 90, will be to boldly go down to the shops unsupervised and come back okay. But in terms of getting away from the fact that it's who it is that's done this. I just, I think, toys for rich boys and rich girls just about sums it up perfectly. It's not for
And
me
not
a
really
good use of
and not really
resources.
in the spirit of COP26 either.
No, I think there are other ways to appreciate the beauty of the planet and other things. It doesn't seem to me to be the most equitable distribution of resources, and I think there are other ways to appreciate the beauty and the majesty of the planet that we're on without getting blasted up to the fringes of space. So it's certainly not something I would be signing up to do, even if I was ever in the unlikely event that I was rich enough to be able to pay for that one.
Okay, well, we'll leave it on that. Thank you very much for joining me this evening. That's all we have time for tonight. We've covered a large number of stories. We end, as we always do, with a reminder to you that it costs money to make these programmes. We're not the BBC. We don't have the large revenue of a channel that sells advertising. So if you've enjoyed this evening and if you support independent broadcasting, please consider going online to www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register and making a regular financial commitment to keep the channel going. We've got a lot planned in the coming months, and we'd love to see you back watching us tomorrow night for Scotland at 7, and of course always for the Sunday show at lunchtime on Sunday. Have a good evening, and we'll see you soon. Good night.